In the last video, we started talking about the writer interface. We're now going to continue by looking at some documentation around the writer interface and figuring out exactly what it means to satisfy the writer interface. So I'm going to flip on over to my Go package documentation, and I'm looking specifically around the documentation for the package IO. Now inside of here, I'm going to scroll down to the index section, and then one of the very last types that is defined inside of here is the type writer. So here's writer. So type writer is an interface. To satisfy the writer interface, your type or some other type that we are using inside of our application must implement a function called write that receives a byte slice and then returns an integer and an error. So you'll notice that this has a function signature that looks very similar to the read function, or excuse me, the read function that we were looking at just a little bit ago. The only difference is that this time around, the byte slice is being used truly as a source of input. So it reads in this byte slice right here, or write receives this byte slice. It takes the data inside the byte slice, and then in theory, the write function right here is supposed to send all that information to some output channel. So maybe that's a text file or the terminal or something else. Now the next thing I want to look at is some of the documentation around the io.copy function. So I want you to just keep all that stuff around the writer interface inside of your head for just 1 minute. So I now want to look at some of the documentation around io.copy. So I'm going to go back to the io package documentation. I'll scroll back up to the top. We'll go to the index section again, and the very first function that is listed here is function copy. So the function copy expects a first argument of some value that implements the writer interface. So that's the interface that we've been talking about in the last video and this one. So the writer interface can be thought of as something that is taking data and sending it outside of our application. Then the second argument to the copy function is something that implements the reader interface. And so we can essentially think of the copy function as being used to take some information from outside of our application and write it or copy it all out to some outside channel. And so that's exactly what we are doing here with this io.copy line. The second argument to this thing is our body property, or the body field off the response struct that you and I know very well implements the reader interface. And so os.standardout right here is a value that implements the writer interface. If we hover over this thing, you'll see that os.standardout is a value. So this is an actual variable right here. This is a value that is exported by the OS package. If we hover over it, you'll see that this standard out value right here is of type file. And so file is a type inside of Go that implements the write interface. So we can kind of think of this entire statement right there, that entire io.copy statement, as looking a little something like this right here. So we have the io.copy function, the first argument, and the second argument. So you and I know that the second argument has to be something that implements the reader interface, and that is response.body. Then the first argument is something that implements the writer interface. One possible value inside of the standard library, or one possible type that implements that interface, is the file type. So os.standardout is a value of type file. File has a function called write, and because it has a function called write that receives a byte slice and returns an integer and an error, we can say that the file type implements the write interface. And that's why we are able to pass os.standardout directly as the first argument to io.copy. Now, I know all this stuff is just like total madness and really nasty, but again, this is the stuff that you got to know to kind of understand Go. And trust me, all this knowledge I'm sharing with you was very, I would say, hard won by myself. It was very hard fought for. Like, it took me a lot of time when I was first learning Go to understand all this stuff. And so I know that this content and everything I'm telling you right now is really, really, really nasty. But trust me, at the end of the day, when you go off to start writing your own programs, even though this stuff is very painful to go over right now, it's going to save you so much time when you go off and start to write your own code. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about is some of the actual internal implementation of io.copy right here. And once we start looking at this io.copy thing, it's going to start to give us a pretty good sense of what's going on with this thing that implements the writer interface and this thing over here that implements the reader interface. So we're going to take a quick break, look at io.copy, like its actual implementation, the actual source code of that function, And then we'll talk about how we can write our own thing that implements the writer interface. And that, again, is going to be where we start to learn a lot more about how these interface things are working ourselves. Okay, so quick break, and we'll come back in just a second.